Well, thanks so much, all of you, for being here. It's really exciting for us to be able to share our work and what we've been writing and researching and thinking about for the past year or so. So my name is Kai Parker. I'm a PhD candidate in history, and I studied religion in Black Chicago in the early to mid part of the 20th century. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the origins of our group and then some of the findings that we've come across just to start us off. So for us, this conversation around reparations at UChicago began about a year ago at a session of the U.S. History Workshop, where graduate students and professors meet and workshop our work, discuss it, a lot of papers in progress, things of that nature. And we had a special session that was geared around reparations and how the issue of reparations should affect how we teach and do history in the department. And we spent some time talking about should we have courses on reparations, things of that nature, how to incorporate reparations into the way that we teach undergrads. But a lot of the discussion hinged on the relationship of the University of Chicago to the issue of reparations. And often, when we think about reparations in the university context, we think about schools that were ostensibly either founded during slavery or in states that are associated with slavery historically, or at least with the Atlantic slave trade, even if they were states in the North. And so schools like Georgetown, Harvard, Brown, those have been at the center of the debate around reparations. And so we were thinking about, well, what is University of Chicago's relationship to reparations historically? And so we had a very good session. A lot of professors came. A lot of students came. And then afterwards, we just did some preliminary research, writing, talking about this issue. And we came across a very interesting and complicated, but also very direct and simple in some ways, connection between the University of Chicago and the institution of slavery. The university itself officially dates its founding as in 1890, 35 years after the passing of the 13th Amendment. And of course, in a state like Illinois, which is not only a state that is in the former Union, but also is the land of Lincoln. But it turns out that this is a fiction. And the university actually has roots directly in slavery. The use of the university originally can be traced back to the founding of a small Baptist college at 35th Street and Cottage Grove in 1856. So at the height of, around the height of the debate over slavery. But actually in a 3,000-acre cotton plantation in Lawrence County, Mississippi, where the labor, lives, and death of hundreds of enslaved persons were used to make the University of Chicago and its current $7 billion endowment possible. So in 1847, the plantation that we're talking about was owned by Mr. Robert Martin, who had approximately 150 slaves and a cotton gin, a textile plant, a modern sugar mill, a private shipping dock, and all this together was worth about $5 million in today's dollars. And his daughter, Martha, fell in love with Stephen A. Douglas, the congressman from Illinois. And Martha and Stephen Douglas were married, and basically Robert Martin gave Douglas the plantation and its affiliated property, including its slaves, as a wedding gift to Douglas by putting it in his will, leaving it in his will to his daughter after he died, and naming Douglas the official property manager. And this was important in part because Douglas was a figure in Illinois who had national political ambitions and did not want to be tied to slavery so directly. So Martin dies a few months after the wedding, and Douglas inherits this property. And he uses the profits that are generated from slavery to buy 100 acres on the south side of Chicago. And this neighborhood, Douglas, still bears his name today, although it's usually referred to as Brownsville since the Great Migration. So in 1856, Douglas donates the acreage, or part of the acreage, on 35th and College Grove for this just small Baptist college that is the University of Chicago. And Douglas himself laid the cornerstone of this university, and was very much tied to the university, so much so that a lot of the critics of Douglass labeled the university Douglass University as a way to tie it to slavery. And one of the important things to think about in thinking about Douglass is that Douglass didn't just happen to be a slaveholder, but he actually advocated for a very punitive version of slaveholding that he practiced on his estate. There's records of many beatings, starvation. He was known even among the slaves as a particularly ferocious slaveholder. So the university starts to borrow against the Douglass land in order to beautify and expand the university, and so it's really from the Douglass land that the university is able to acquire its reputation as being a leading university, and so all of this is at a time when Douglass is very much implicated in not only the official financial dealings of the university, but also the publicity of the university. His name is really synonymous with it in many ways. But this becomes very problematic, in part because the issue of slavery is raging at this time. And so between the raising of the slavery issue and the massive debt that the property was incurring, the trustees of the university end up changing the name of the original organization to the Old University of Chicago, and then create a new entity, ostensibly, the University of Chicago, and then move the location of the University of Chicago from the Douglass campus to the current Hyde Park campus. And this was thought of as a way to restore both the financial and, in a sense, reputational standing of the university. The association of the university with slavery becomes so toxic that it influenced the Divinity School actually leaving the original campus and moving to Morgan Park. It was only after the school after the university moved to Hyde Park that the Divinity School rejoins the universities in total. And so in 1890, this new University of Chicago is founded, but it's really very directly tied to the old University of Chicago, not only in terms of financially, but also just in terms of the reputation of the school. It really begins when it's tied directly to slavery. And one of the things that's really important to think about in this regard is that while a lot of the other universities that are tied to slavery are still imaginable without slavery, you could still have a Harvard or a Georgetown. Maybe they would have been smaller, less wealthy, and less prestigious, but they still would have existed without such a direct tie to slavery. But the University of Chicago really is quite directly founded in slavery on land that was acquired through Douglass's acquiring of a large and very brutally run plantation. And so the university has really an existential tie to slavery that makes it different than even a lot of the older universities and universities that are much more located in the geography that we usually associate with slavery. What's also interesting about this is that the university is founded in 1890 during a period that in history think of as sectional reconciliation, where the North and the South are really trying to come back together and establish a kind of new identity for a country that had been riven by the slave issue and the sectional crisis for decades before then. And so in many ways, the founding of the new University of Chicago symbolically inaugurates this new founding of an America that is united, that has gotten past slavery, and that can now move forward under a common goal. And the enlightenment the university embodies as being, even now, as being not tied to the kind of genteel identity that we associate with, say, the Ivies and other East Coast institutions, really is inseparable from this new founding. And so the university is very much directly tied to slavery existentially. And we can talk more about what that means moving forward, even in terms of the history of the university and in the almost 130 years since its official new founding. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, this attempt to kind of paradigmatically refound the university as being in a post-slavery environment when it's really existentially bound to the slave, to its slave roots. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it off to
Yeah,
Guy.
thanks. No, that was fantastic. My name is Guy Mount, so I'm now a postdoc fellow in the history department. When we started working on this, I was also a grad student in the department at the university here. And currently I'm teaching a course, the first that I know of, on the global history of reparations. So we've been thinking through some of these issues. It was obviously sparked by this research that we did together. And then now I'm trying to kind of think through how to conceptualize reparations. So that course is very much a conceptual and kind of exploratory course that I'm doing. And so I wanted to share some of kind of the learnings that I've kind of derived from that course. I have some amazing students, and we've been reading some really challenging texts in terms of how do you think about reparations conceptually? Like, what is it, right? The term itself, and we debated, right, whether we would even include the term reparations in the piece, right? Or if we would use some other kind of, phrasing to kind of think through what it means. Ultimately, we decided to go with it because in some sense it has a cachet, but then in another sense it's also bound to, I think, a very limited kind of understanding of what it would mean, right? So most people, when they hear reparations, they would just think, a check, right? The federal government writes a check to people and end of story. But if you actually look into how reparations is being conceptualized in a lot of ways by international attorneys, right? In global human rights law and international law, reparations are much more nuanced, much more complicated, really multivalent, and so I kind of want to share some of those things with you. So it's not a tort-driven process in the same way that I think we're really conceptualizing of it in the United States, right? And so knowing that you guys are attorneys and attorneys in the making, right, I think one of the things that we've been trying to think through and that they're already doing internationally is thinking kind of beyond a simple tort transactional relationship of how do you repair in the international frame, gross crimes against humanity, right? And in international law, there's this establishment that crimes against humanity are a special kind of category in international law where there is no statute of limitations and there are special kind of burdens that have to be met in order to basically have justice for those particular kinds of crimes. And in the 2001 Durban Declaration, this was highly contested and highly debated, but ultimately this UN body declared that slavery, surprise, surprise, was in fact a crime against humanity, right? It was so egregious a crime that it needs to be treated with this special kind of category in the law. Has anyone had a course so far, or as their kind of career as an attorney, do they teach, do you have a class on restorative justice as a concept? Right? How about arbitration? So this is the other one. Did you guys get any training in arbitration? This idea of kind of a procedure that would happen in some ways, right? So maybe a little, right? Where they're going to talk about a less adversarial kind of process that people would go through in order to settle a dispute rather than the typical. So this is real big in the restorative justice community. So restorative justice is this wide open field now that people are really actively contesting these terms, right? Restorative justice, reparative justice, transformative justice, transitional justice. These are all different ways to think about it, as opposed to what the United States is. So how would you, if there's one of those terms, is there one that's being used in the law school right now to describe this current justice system that we live in the United States? Adversarial is definitely one, right? Punitive, right? If you actually think through how our legal system works in the United States, it's definitely adversarial. And maybe I'll start to go through these, right? It's adversarial. It's individualistic, right? It assumes outside of, let's say, class action lawsuits, right, that are still ultimately tied back to the individual, right? The typical way that this is framed is it's an individualistic kind of legal proceeding. It's adversarial. And it's ultimately compulsory, right? You can't opt out or into, if the state sues you or someone sues you, literally have to, on the threat of violence, actually show up. It's binary, right? Are there any multilateral legal proceedings that it's plaintiff, defendant, you're going to fight it out, right? May the best fighter in some ways win, right? There's not really a truth-seeking element to it. This is, of course, why, attorneys, when you guys get grief, right, what do they give you grief for? Oh, you'll just defend anything or prosecute anything, whether you believe it's true or not. You're quote-unquote liars. But it's really the structure itself that requires you to do that, right? That's the punitive, binary justice system that ultimately is working here. What punitive justice ultimately asks is a question, right? And this will help us, I think. The first question that it would ask, right, is what law was broken? The second question it would ask is who broke that law? And the third question is what is the right punishment to dole out for the breaking of that law? It's really the nuts and bolts of how it's supposed to work. It's absolutist in the sense that the state is kind of the sole authority to decide these things. So if I were to punch Kai in the face, it wouldn't be a relationship between me and Kai that would have to be rendered under punitive justice. My act is considered a crime against the state, not a crime necessarily against Kai, right? So what happens in restorative justice, it kind of flips all this on its head, and it starts with a fundamentally different set of questions. So the first question it would start with is this question of who has been harmed, right? Not what law was broken, right? So if I punch Kai, it's not a question of what law, that's clear, that's pretty obvious, but who was harmed, right? And that question actually is much more difficult to get at than might seem at the surface. At the surface, you could just say, oh, Kai was harmed. But perhaps maybe I broke my fist on Kai's jaw, right? And we can talk about who should repair that, who's responsible for that, which actually does lead us to the second question is, if someone was harmed, the second question punitive justice or restorative justice asks is, what are the needs of the person who was harmed, right? Harm generates needs, right? So when someone is harmed, there's a particular need that is generated as a result of that harm. And so asking that question and asking it deeply, right? What are Kai could suffer from all kinds of things after I punched him in the face, right? And there's a whole slew of things that kind of can be explored there. And then the third question is who's responsible? It doesn't presume that the state is responsible for fixing this. It says who is ultimately responsible for meeting the needs of the person who has been harmed. Also seems like a simple question, but it's actually very complicated. Cam Howard, who's one of our kind of community partners, has a notion of internal reparations, right? That even people who have been harmed, right? There are certain obligations that arise when you have been harmed to say, I demand justice, I must have this, and so and so. So restorative justice, as opposed to the punitive model we're in, it's flexible, it's non-binary. It's voluntary. So what we're asking at the University of Chicago, it's a voluntary process, right? We're not asking the university we're not going to force them. We don't have the power to enforce it in some ways, but all reparations are considered voluntary kind of transactions and procedures that would happen between people. The other thing that restorative justice does is it really embraces the complexity of harm and admits that people who did harm are often doing so because they were at some point harmed themselves. And so a lot of people that have been using this technique in the criminal justice system, as opposed to kind of the more political sense that we're thinking of it, they've been really concerned with this idea of reintegrating the person who has offended and really thinking through the needs of the person who has offended just as much as the person who was, let's say, directly harmed, right? Knowing that people who harm often were harmed themselves, right? But in the current model we have, right, the punitive justice model, we're in a situation where the state harms people who harm people to show people that harming is bad. Right? So it's this fantastic cycle of harm that just keeps perpetuating itself so that the person who was then harmed by the state comes out more alienated from the society, hasn't really bridged the relationships between the people that they did harm, and ultimately you have this kind of really cycle that in many ways is feeding our current cycle of mass incarceration, right? And so I think restorative justice as a concept, right, it works in, let's just call it the political front that we're working on it with, but it also works in the kind of questions that you guys are dealing with as attorneys as well, because it's giving a different model and a different way to think about justice conceptually, and really a different way to think about politics and how people relate to one another in terms of their political relationships that can really reset, I think, some of the really archaic, I mean, if you think about punitive justice, it's a really archaic, mosaic even kind of concept in terms of how do you deal with justice. So some things to look at here, example-wise. New Zealand, for example. So one of the examples we studied in our course is the entire nation of New Zealand actually has taken their entire juvenile justice system and turned it into a restorative justice framework, right? Where these questions that I'm describing are the first questions that are asked, and the state is not involved in issues of juvenile justice either at the school level or at the actual criminal courts level. There's a whole first layer of response where this restorative justice model is implemented, and if it fails, then they always have the kind of state mechanisms as a backup. But they've had incredible success in terms of recidivism, in terms of these daily relationships that students have with one another. It's just a more humane kind of way to do it, and we think on a big scale that we're going to need to come to that re-understanding of justice if reparations writ large on, let's say, a national level or even at a university level, kind of case-by-case basis. I think it's both a condition to have reparations, and I think it's also a benefit that society as a whole will ultimately derive from reparations, namely a reworked understanding of kind of what justice is. So in that way, it's a pretty ambitious project, I guess you could say. The other example I'd like to kind of plug is the Oakland public school system. So the Oakland public school system, kind of in the same vein as New Zealand, now has this restorative justice framework that they're teaching kids from a very young age how to engage in conflict resolution, dispute resolution, and ultimately make restitution and restore things when they've harmed someone. And that's actually under the direction of Fiona Davis, who's actually Angela Davis's sister, who was a former civil rights attorney who spent all her life kind of fighting in this adversarial model. And the way that she describes it is, I was fighting for civil rights, I was fighting for justice for my clients, and even when we won, we lost. Because we were so defeated by the process, we were so just, no one felt restored, no one felt whole after having to go through that process, and that's when she discovered restorative justice as a different way to think about getting to justice. That is, again, I think where the world as a whole is going, but the U.S. right now is really lagging behind the rest of the world. The rest of the world has really normalized reparations in the wake of Jewish reparations that happened during the Holocaust. That was the opening kind of bell, as it were, and now you can go to places as diverse as Sierra Leone. They've had one, obviously South Africa, Venezuela, Peru, Argentina. Many countries we have a good amount of case studies that have been kind of worked through on this, and it just works better. And so I would encourage you guys to kind of think it through. I'm happy to provide that syllabus, provide readings, but it's something that as you're in, just understand that the law you're learning is not the only kind of law that exists, right? The justice that you're seeking, that you're trying to institute, is not the only way to do it. There are other models. So.
Mine will be shorter. My name is Kane Jordan. I'm a second-year PhD student in the history department. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing since we found this information, and sort of building on both Guy and Kai's words, how we're like moving towards a harm reduction model, and like in the ways in which we see that working out. So essentially, like, rather than, also we're working less with a sort of top-down approach where the university dictates what should happen. We're going to community members first to figure out what demands they need and what are their needs based on the continued harm that the university has perpetrated against them. So we want community members essentially to, rather than the university leading the process and setting the guidelines, our aim is to have sort of the community in the forefront of the decision-making process. And to that end, we've been in talks with several community organizations like COCO, or Kenwood Oakland Community Organization, which isn't too far from here, the Bronzeville Historical Society, Southside Organizing Together for Power, which is a predominantly youth organization in the community, and others on campus, such as the Graduate Student Union and the U Chicago for Community Benefits Agreement, and others in the larger Chicago area, such as INCOVA, which is a national reparations organization, and R3, which is bringing together community organizations within Chicago based on sort of like a underserved and race-specific and labor-specific focus to essentially build power for the oppressed. And all of those organizations and more that we've been speaking to we see those as creating a coalition for kind of affecting the vision that I laid out. With community groups kind of like articulating their needs through the reparations framework that that we've set forward. And to that end, one kind of crucial aspect of this is going to be the Reparations Commission, which we're going to launch tonight. Later on tonight at about 6.
Yeah, we got flyers, sir.
Yeah, and we'll have flyers. And basically, we're going to have a lot of the community organizations that we've been talking to. So, like, Black Lives Matter Chicago will be there. As GSC will be there. The Association for Black Psychologists will be there as well. So we're going to have we're going to bring a lot of these folks who we've been speaking to in the room so that they can all essentially speak to one another and sort of articulate what they want to see, rather than the way that other models have worked, such as with Georgetown, where it's been more dictated by the university as in what exactly will happen. And then after they articulate their needs, then we're going to build more, or we're going to get more community organizations together, and then from there, tally up the sort of needs that are required by the community based on harm, and then after that, hopefully bring the university to the table to have this process of this reparative process, where not only the community feels as though they will no longer be able to experience the harm that the university has perpetrated in ways like, buying up land, speculating on housing, building these new hotels, collaborating with the sort of CBA process, in such a way that that would not give jobs to the community and would in fact limit the mobility of many people within the community. But also ensure that the university would, after the process, undergo a healing process itself. So that both parties feel as though they have been transformed, through this commission and through this entire process of sort of truth-seeking and reconciliation.
Okay, I think we're questions, comments, ideas, suggestions.
I was wondering how your research ties in with the legacy of institutions like Oxford and Cambridge, and the entire, how do you differentiate the legacy of racism in an institution like the University of Chicago with essentially colonial institutions, and there are many similarities, I think, with how Oxford and Cambridge came up. So is that something which you have in your course?
In the course, yeah, we do have, and actually there's I'm trying to remember his name. We watched a YouTube video. It's this fantastic YouTube video from, I think it's the former Prime Minister, or one of the Prime Ministers of India, who gives us, is this the one you're talking about, right? Where he gives this fantastic just breakdown of colonialism and the way that reparations can serve as a way to think through the legacy of colonialism, right? The harm that happened during colonialism, and is there a way to make it right? And so I think, yeah, it opens up, one of the critiques, right, from the far right, usually the far right. Our story made it to Fox News, which I would suggest never having happen to any of your work. You don't want it in Fox News, but it ended up getting there. And so one of the critiques we often get is, well, if you do this, then it opens up reparations for all kinds of things, right? Where does it stop? It just keeps on going forever. And we're like, yeah, actually, that's quite okay. I think it would be great if this restorative model, right, could be applied to scenarios like colonialism, models like the dispossession of indigenous lands, right? And in many ways, that's already happening, right? Indigenous peoples are thinking these questions through. Colonized peoples are thinking these questions through. And where colonialism and slavery really come together is, of course, in the Caribbean, right? And so a lot of the Caribbean nations have now organized a collective in CARICOM where they're working, they have a reparations commission. They've all the nations have signed on, and they're actually going back towards the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, and trying to think through what, and this can take the form of nation-to-nation debt relief. This can take the form of all kinds of things. And so those conversations are happening internationally, for sure.
Could you just make it a little more concrete how reparations might look like in this context in Chicago? I guess you mentioned that people are still debating, trying to figure out what would be best. I guess I really just have not very much idea of what it would look like on the ground, or could look like.
Yeah, and I think it's not for us to say in some ways, right? I mean, this is for the descendants of enslaved peoples themselves, and I think it's also for the community on the south side of Chicago, because one of the things we didn't talk about is there's also restrictive covenants that the University of Chicago has supported. There's University of Chicago policing. So there's a lot of ideas we've heard. I mean, we can convey some of the ideas that we heard that I think should be decided democratically by the community itself, right? But ideas we've heard from communities, and it's curious, none of them have ever said, we want to check. This is curious, actually, right? This is the fear that I think white America as a whole kind of has, right? It's never come up. And Michael Dawson at the University of Chicago has done work on this, and that never comes up either, right? It's like the lowest thing on the totem pole that community members actually want. We've heard things like, we want access to actually law services is one of them, right? We have our free law service. The university has all these law students. We don't even know the basics. Can the university open itself up and provide free legal services, right? This is something community members said. Meeting spaces, right? You have all these empty buildings, and my daughter wants to have a birthday party for her kid, and there's no space in our tiny little apartment, and we got to rent a hall. Can the university open up space for this? So those are the kinds of kind of baseline things that community members have been asking for. Conceptually, some of the things we've been thinking about are maybe more on what's called transformative justice, right? Which thinks through how do you transform the university? So this is maybe to get a little more concretely. How do you get the university to not repeat its harm that happened? So the CBA coalition right now that's working on the Obama Library question, right? They're asking that basically any development that's happening that the university is involved in, there should be community input, and there should be a particular community benefit for it. So the community benefits agreement is one tangible, exact thing that the university could and should be doing, that the community is already asking for, that would constitute what we're conceptualizing in this way as preemptive reparations, right? It's stopping harm before it happens. The community is saying, if you do this, it's going to harm us, and we don't want you to do this. And so a transformed university would have a governance structure in place such that that would be a permanent way that the university does business, such that the next development that the university does, the community would ultimately get to say yay or nay, right? Because the community has been harmed in the past, doesn't want to be harmed in the future, and a transformed reparative process would just mean the community has a say. It doesn't cost any money. The university could do that right now. They could sign the CBA right now. It doesn't cost them anything. And so those kinds of both very small, I don't want to call them small, but kind of on-the-ground questions or what it might look like, and then these bigger questions of community control, labor union control of the university. I mean, we're probably, who knows where this was made? I don't know where this was made. I know a labor union could dig into this and figure out if slave labor, modern-day slave labor, produced this, but we aren't even asking that question now, right? So those are reparative functions that can not only give some satisfaction to community members for the things that have happened in the past, but then also at the same time be forward-looking and think through how can you make sure the university is a more just place kind of going forward. I don't know if that's concrete enough. It still might be a little in the air, but it just is in the air. I mean, I think that the problem with the way, as Kane was describing, right, the problem with these other institutions, they said, oh yeah, this is repair, right? This is what you get. You get what is it at Georgetown? You get tuition, right? If you were a direct descendant of a slave that we sold, you get free tuition. The community now is rising up. The descendants are like, that's not what we want, right? And so I think that conversation, I think we need to rest with that conversation and allow that conversation to happen rather than rush too quickly, I think, to this. What's it supposed to look like? What's it going to be? I think part of the healing is to go through the process, right? And to allow that to be something community-driven and messy for right now.
And that distinguishes it from it's not about just reforming the practice of the university, but having community members involved in deciding what the future of the university is going to look like. Because even now there's a lot of rhetoric at the university. It's out about how it's reformed its own relationship to the south side of Chicago, for instance. The important thing is that people have actual ideas about how they want the community to look like and how they want the university to interact with the community. And those are the things that need to be centered in any discussion about reparations. It's not just about bestowing money or other kinds of programs benevolently upon people, but it's about that interaction, which of course is the interaction that gave rise to the university in the first place, but it was very one way at that point. It's not about kind of remaking the character or the content of the kind of one way direction of the university's relationship to Black people, but it's about really restructuring that entire relationship moving forward.
That's right. It can't be PR, basically.
So, I'm like descendant of slaves, was a fellow undergraduate fellow in history, and am from Hyde Park, so I'm like really interested in this project. Is there any way, I know you offered to send your syllabus, and I will definitely take that, but is there any way to kind of keep track of the way this is going? Like, is there like a website blog or some way to keep in mind? Because if I can attend this like particular meeting that's happening, then what can I do?
Yeah. Guy mans our Twitter, in which in which I think he's live streaming on. And we'll also, I guess we'll give that to folks. It's @THERAUC. Is that right? And the same would go for the Facebook. It's Facebook. I think it's facebook.com/the but also. It would be great if you could give us like your emails because that's another way that we're trying to basically not only keep people informed but also like mobilize people, especially like if they're very interested in the project. We see what we're doing as being very not only community oriented but also like very much like entrenched within different community struggles. So. One of the things that we've been also like thinking about, as Guy kind of mentioned, it is the CBA, and so if there is something, usually if we actually just had an event, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, with the CBA coalition on campus, where we talked about the ways in which reparations and the community benefits agreement. Are these things that are kind of inextricably linked because of, not only the ties to the university, but also like the harm reduction model that we've been, that is at the center of what we're trying to do. So yeah, I think emails would also work.
So when you're a law student, often your imagination is whittled down to the current structure of the legal system, which you've mentioned is extremely punitive. So for law students who are working within this school and this specific legal institution, what are ways in which you see this project taking hold in the law school and ways that students on their own can maybe expand that imagination for what could be possible within the legal system?
So here's an imagination expander for you. 2002, in the city of Chicago actually passed a Slavery Disclosure Act. And what this means is that any entity that does business with the city of Chicago, by law now, right, has to disclose its historical ties to slavery. If it doesn't disclose its historical ties to slavery, the university can, and there's some debate here in terms of the law, right, if it's can or must, and right now it's really written kind of as can, that the city council can, by that fact alone, right, cancel the contract that institution has with it. So the University of Chicago, this is actually one of the things that our community partners, NCOBRA is very, they often get pegged sometimes as a very legal-heavy institution. There's a lot of lawyers in NCOBRA, and they've done a lot of court cases directly in regards to reparations, and they were the ones, the attorneys at NCOBRA were the ones behind this Slavery Disclosure Act, actually, right? And so there's a question of how do you enforce this Slavery Disclosure Act? And one of the things that the attorneys at NCOBRA are trying to do is craft new legislation that will make it more enforceable. The city of Philadelphia has a much stronger Slavery Disclosure Act that has more kind of triggering implementation features, right, where there's actual consequences that are immediate if someone doesn't disclose their ties to slavery. But the University of Chicago has all kinds of contracts with the city of Chicago, the Obama Library not being the least of them. So what the attorneys at NCOBRA are doing is they're trying to get the city to enforce the Slavery Disclosure Act and at least force the University of Chicago to disclose their ties to slavery, which requires, under the law, a lot of research, right? They have to open up all their records. They have to do all this work in order to fully disclose their ties to slavery. And so that's one of the ways in terms of the law school. NCOBRA actually just asked me a few days ago, do you know anybody that can go down and figure out what are all the contracts that the city of Chicago and the University of Chicago have? We don't even know that, right? That's public information, but we're not really, I don't know, I mean, I know there's this, I'm not sure if the contract's been finalized for the CBA, but the University of Chicago Police Department is actually in violation of this law, right? They have a contract with the city of Chicago. I don't know what it says. I've never seen the contract, but it's public record and it is there. So any lawyers that want a nice project, right? Just simple question, right? What are all the contracts that the University of Chicago has with the city of Chicago? It's public information. It should be widely known on campus, but I don't know what all those contracts look like, right? And are all those contracts kind of thinking about this question, or they have their own kind of agenda? And I think that's one place I would love to see. We would love to have, law students think about, help about, and work on. And we can get you in contact with NCOBRA if you're interested. And there's a lot of really prominent attorneys actually that would be good to intern for. Some of them very prominent civil rights attorneys that are there. So the people that worked on, for example, the Chicago torture cases, right? A lot of those are NCOBRA members. That's one of the legal examples where lawyers got in front of this and were able to pressure in that case, the city of Chicago to offer reparations for torture, which seems like the least one could do, right? When you torture someone, but yeah.
You mentioned that this process is supposed to be voluntary, and I guess as a law student, I'm skeptical of like bad actors engaging in voluntary processes in good faith. So what could that possibly look like, and what do you expect the university might do?
There have been certain rhetorical strategies. I mean, one of the things that the debate can sometimes be reduced to is a question of the date, and is to what degree are the two institutions, to what degree is it significant that there are two separate entities, and what does that mean? And when we have discussions, different people have kind of different opinions on what the significance of that would be in a response. So preliminarily, that's been a big issue. We have ways to. There's ways to kind of to get around that, but we haven't really gotten to the point where that has been the focal point of a kind of direct critique. But it's been kind of out in there's been kind of feelers around that.
And unfortunately, this is another thing that my course has gone through. Every time reparations has happened, right? And this is for the for Jews in Germany as a result of the Holocaust, reparations happened. Japanese Americans, right? 1988 in the United States, reparations happened. Every single time it's happened by a bad actor acting in a self-interested manner, actually. Every single time it's happened, and this is a problem we've been going through. Has it ever happened? Well, historically, it just hasn't, right? There's always been these bad actors, and there's always been some ulterior motive where it was in their best interest to do reparations. And so the way activists are starting to think is, okay, how can we effectively create those conditions? We're reading an article by Gerald Horne that's his argument is that reparations, when they happen, they're going to happen on the back of American empire, and it's going to be in the interest of big capitalism. It's problematic, right? But if it's going to happen, historically that's the way it has happened, and it's probably the way it's going to happen. So one of the things we've been thinking about is the university as a nation in miniature. Which if you think about it, the university actually does function as a nation in miniature, right? Has its police force, has its borders, has its president, which is not elected, incidentally, right? So it's kind of like a dictatorship if you're into political theory, right? It's this wealthy, it's really a plutocracy in a lot of ways because it's a wealthy board of donors, right, that basically crown the president, right? And so the way that decisions kind of make and the way they happen, it's a nation in miniature. So if you can figure out where the fault lines are within that system, right, and figure out some way that it's probably going to end up in PR, right? It's probably going to end up that the university is going to see that they're getting shamed so badly, right? And this is students aren't wanting to come to the campus. The Bannon organization right now, right? There's this great group of alumni that are now refusing to donate to the University of Chicago and are instead donating to institutions on the south side of Chicago until the university rescinds the offer for Bannon to come, right? So that's basically a shaming device that these activists are using, right, in order to move the decision making of a bad actor, right, in a way that fits what they want. I think those, and we're trying to convince them that when the Bannon thing is over, they should do the same thing. The university, we will not donate to the university until it acknowledges its ties to slavery, establishes a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and funds the reparation commission of these groups, right? So I think that's, and they're going to end up, just like they did with the Trauma Center. I don't know if folks followed the Trauma Center campaign, but the university, at the end of this, did this benevolent kind of gesture. Where, oh, we're opening this Trauma Center campaign because of our wonderful, love for the community. They were forced to do that, right? It was activists on the ground that had to pressure for 4 or 5 years until they did it. And it eventually just became so, problematic for them in terms of their PR. And the Obama Library was involved there too. That was one of the tools that the commission used, or the Coalition for the Trauma Center used, was to say no Obama Library without a trauma center, and that was affecting them nationally and internationally. It's always been external pressure. My study in terms of the history of any kind of reparations, it's always come externally. It's never been an internal come to Jesus moment where an institution or a person has said, oh, yay, we should just do this, right? It's always been some external stimuli that involved self-interest, unfortunately.
I was actually going to bring up the trauma center point a little bit, and I was kind of thinking about the fact that people from the community had to go in and get arrested and do all kinds of things to protest in order to create the pressure for this trauma center. And I'm wondering if that in and of itself is also demanding of reparations, and how you think something like that could be implemented as well. Like the fact that last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, there was there was a whole series of talks on activism on the South Side, and people who were actually not allowed on the university's campus were allowed in that space to be able to talk because they had been arrested for protesting the trauma center. I'm wondering what you think the university's responsibilities.
And really in process of this transition, when Black Chicago was really being formed as at least on the South Side, as a segregated, coherent entity physically, and has been very, very involved in all sorts of the processes that have happened over the years. Very involved in the building of or the moving of thousands of Black Hyde Park residents out of Hyde Park and into other parts in Chicago, mostly into the State Street corridor housing projects back in the middle part of the 20th century, when it was threatening the city to leave if the projects weren't developed and if people weren't moved out. And so there's an ongoing ongoing harm that's happened that's been very much. I mean, one of the things we've been thinking about is, are there folks who say were displaced from Hyde Park, who then ended up in, say, Robert Taylor Homes or something, who were then thrown out of Robert Taylor Homes, who then ended up dying on the way to a hospital because they couldn't. There's a trauma center. There's definitely a connection between those things that we're trying to tease out. But yeah, no, that's a really important point to raise.
I'm just curious about the role of certain collateral institutions to the university, like, for example, CTS or LSTC or all these theological schools that happen to be here in Hyde Park, who essentially benefited from the university's presence, but maybe have not been they're not big enough to, I don't know, maybe they are big enough to have other negative impacts on the neighborhood. What role should they play in this process?
Yeah, I'd say they should study their own history, right? I mean, the truth and reconciliation, people want to jump to reconciliation very quickly, but the truth process is first, right? That's one of the first demands that we kind of have is let's get to the truth. And I don't know those institutions' relationships, but the one thing I do know, Chicago Theological Seminary, I always tell this story. Jesse Jackson went to the Chicago Theological Seminary to get his doctorate in divinity. And during the 60s, when the March on Selma was happening, he used to get up on the tables there and, yell and scream for, let's go down to Selma if you're a real Christian and you're really, this, that, and the other. You'll come down to Selma and stand with Dr. King. That's now the Becker Friedman Institute, right? That's the physical building, right? Used to have a seminary co-op, and now where Jesse Jackson stood, there's a Starbucks, that doesn't feel reparative to me, right? That doesn't feel like it kind of on it. But that's maybe besides the point, right? But those kinds of questions, right? You make that decision, right? I think that decision is a different decision-making process that happens in light of knowing the history, right? When you know the history and you know what it was, those institutions presumably either would voluntarily act differently, have a different culture, or at least activists on the ground could then remind them, right, that, hey, this is your history. Should you really be making that decision given your history? I think that's one of the ways that this can work. So for another example, the University of Chicago is building, 1,400 units just south of the Midway, and it's actually going to be privatized. So they're actually going to privatize those units. There's going to be a venture capitalist firm that's going to provide the funding and the construction management to actually build and fund the things. And then they'll continue to generate profit, right, residually off of their ownership of the University of Chicago student housing. That firm is all white from Birmingham, Alabama. I cannot make that up. That venture capital, right, if you're an all-white firm in Birmingham, Alabama, the odds that that money that you have to invest in the University of Chicago comes from slavery is really high. I mean, really, really high. So a university that's engaged in a reparative would you ever make that decision, right? That's a disastrous decision to make with the history that you have. You just can't do that, right? So I think those are the ways, right, in which a reparative kind of, it's not even so much a project or a program, it's just a worldview in some ways, right? A restorative justice worldview that you're never going to get away from this history. It's always going to be here, right? But it's what kind of decisions are you going to make going forward that take that into account and kind of make the world a better place going forward, I think is the trick. And every institution has their own histories and should engage in this process.
Obviously, I think most of us in the room would agree that, trying to act financially in a way that shows that you are acknowledging your history and trying to act restoratively and reparatively is something that is a paramount social value. But the university used the Calvin Report to argue against divesting from South Africa during apartheid. So I'm wondering if you see that as any sort of issue going forward and how you could work around it.
Yeah, it's an issue.
It's
No, it is.
And I want to know what you think about that. It's insane.
No, it is insane, and it's one of the other things. If you look at reparations at large, the potential for co-option is really, really high, right? And the potential some of the tricks. The university is very clever, right? And the administration is very smart. It knows what's going on. The thing it did with graduate students, for example, right, and graduate students trying to unionize, right, the propaganda, and I use that term very deliberately because it was actually paid propaganda, right, that they hired a specific firm to engage in propaganda with the student body, right, which again, if you're talking about labor abuses, right, and the idea that slavery is the worst labor abuse and you're going to have this relationship to organized labor going forward, seems to be very problematic. But they use this to get back to this question of the report, right, and how the rhetoric is kind of getting shifted. I don't know if you guys remember the email we got as grad students, but it said something like, why would you want to unionize and commodify your relationship to the university and financialize it? Aren't you, right? So it's taking this kind of almost pseudo-left language, right, to try to convince you that you're commodifying your relationship and therefore monetizing what is a sacred kind of relationship between you and your faculty members, which of course smeared over the fact that faculty members don't pay us, right? There's, then we work, and when you work, you should get paid, and you should have some say in that. So I think, yeah, it's a very, by playing hardball, because the university's response, by the way, which I don't think we kind of talked about, it's been a flat denial. Didn't happen, different legal entities, we don't care. We want nothing to do with this, right? Which is totally off of the rails in terms of every other major elite university that's dealing with exactly the same issues. Their point on this in terms of the legal entities, my God, I mean, Columbia is dealing with this. Columbia used to be King's College, for God's sake, under a different political polity. It was under like the king of, I mean, they've gone through so many reorganizations and changes. Rutgers went from public to private, and it's a ridiculous argument, but it's one that they're making because I think they don't know they don't know how to spin it yet, right? They don't know how they're going to spin their way out of this right now.
One of the important things about having it centered in the community is precisely to make sure that there's an ongoing critique that's coming from the community, so it's not something where there's some kind of triumphal bow that can be put on at the end and then can be trotted out as an example of what the university is doing. As long as if people are centered, then that would just kind of keep the process critical throughout. That's our hope, at least.
So I don't think anyone else has any more questions, and it's almost time for people to go to class. So thank you all for coming.
Sweet.